Actually, we might get you, if you just wanted to do the keynote from the podium, and then we'll take a seat after that. Yep.
Go straight
Yes.
away?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks
We'll
very
go
much.
straight into it. I've done the housekeeping. You're all set.
Well, thank you. Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to say how delighted I am to be here today with my colleagues, Minister Simon Coveney and Minister Helen McEntee, and also Noel O'Connell of the European Movement to launch this Citizens' Dialogue on the Future of Europe. Exactly 70 years ago, representatives from 16 countries met in Paris to discuss how, in the words of Jean Monnet, they could resist economic decline and preserve political freedom. Ireland was one of those 16 countries, and we quickly came to see the wisdom of Monnet's prediction that there was no future for the people of Europe other than in union. And it is the promise of a better future that has motivated people to work for the European ideal over successive decades. And it's why we want to hear all of your views in the debate about its future, because we all have a stake in it, and how it evolves, and how it will affect all of us. New challenges such as Brexit sharpen our focus. But we face, of course, many other issues in the European Union. We have war and instability to the east and south, unprecedented and uncontrolled migration flows, the effects of climate change, and increased fears about international terrorism. We see the rise of new economic powers and emerging economies, and new unpredictable regimes around the world. The inevitable march of democracy, free trade, human rights, and multilateralism look much less inevitable now than perhaps they did a few years ago. And I think if anyone thinks that we're stronger facing these challenges alone, they haven't heeded the lessons of the past. On Sunday, I was in Enniskillen for Remembrance Sunday. And while there, remembering the dead, I was struck by something that we should not forget, that Europe is at its heart a peace project. And as John Hume once said, the EU is the most successful peace process in history. And it's no coincidence that the development of the EU has coincided with the longest ever period of peace and prosperity on the European continent. Today, across all EU institutions, we see representatives of countries that went to war with each other twice in the past 100 years, now sitting side by side. And at the European Council, I'm joined by 27 other Prime Ministers and Presidents, and we sit together, sharing sovereignty, creating prosperity, and cooperating to overcome the challenges that we all face. The EU is one of the most successful political projects in human history. It brought to end war in Europe by creating a dynamic for peace and cooperation. The customs union and the single market brought about tariff-free trade, fair competition, and removed regulatory barriers. The common agricultural policy has supported farm incomes, sustained our rural communities, and kept food prices low and stable, and has protected the European model of family farming. The euro, our currency, has eliminated currency fluctuations within the Eurozone, reduced interest rates and kept inflation low, and enlargement to the east and south has secured democracy and human rights across the continent and helped drive economic growth. And our EU citizenship allows us to travel, work, trade or study anywhere from Athens to Achill without any need for visas or work permits, and we can of course access each other's health services and other public services. And this, as many of you will know here, is the 30th anniversary of the creation of the Erasmus programme, allowing students the opportunity to study in another European country. Indeed, it's been estimated that there are close to 1 million Erasmus babies now, people born as a consequence of students who met each other while on Erasmus programmes. And rather than a competitive race to the bottom, EU social rights have ensured greater equality between men and women, safer workplaces, better pay, sick leave, parental leave, holidays and workers' rights. And far from being a fortress, Europe has shown itself able to open itself to the world through a very progressive neighbourhood policy the Eastern Partnership, for example, Euromed. And you also see in recent trade deals, for example, CETA, the trade deal with Canada, and also the EU-Japan deal, which will help Irish exporters and increase FDI. So looking at this list of achievements over the past few decades, it's hard to understand why anyone might want to leave. But whatever happens in the next few years, one thing is certain: Ireland will always remain at the heart of the common European home which we helped to build. So that's why it's so important that we are actively engaged in shaping and influencing the debate about the future of European policy. It's a conversation that we'd be having even if there was no Brexit, and it's one that is at least as important. And I believe in having this debate about the future of Europe, we should do so with a positive attitude, talking about what we want to achieve rather than the things that we want to block or fear. And many of the policy challenges we face as a country are increasingly global, and they can't be met by nation states acting alone. Issues such as mass migration, climate change, cybersecurity, cyber attacks, trade, the regulation of medicines, the regulation of major corporations can't be solved by 28 different countries coming up with 28 different solutions. Only in unity is there security, and in cooperation there is strength. We also need to accept that in the Europe of the future, all EU states will be small states, even if some of the larger ones don't quite realise it yet. If you look at the list of the top 60 cities in the world in terms of population, how many of those 60 are in the European Union? And the answer is just one. And don't celebrate yet because it's about to leave. In terms of population, Germany, with 80 million people, is the only country in the top 20 in the world, and it's at 18th place, and its population is falling. It's already been overtaken by Mexico, the Philippines, Ethiopia, and Vietnam in terms of population. Thailand today already has more people than the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. And Tanzania and Myanmar will overtake the UK, France, and Italy within a few years. Population, of course, does not equate to economic or military strength, but there can be no doubt that these are also shifting east and south globally. So we're going to need to stick together in the decades ahead if we're to protect what we have, what we believe in, and if we're going to export our values worldwide. So the Europe of the future that I believe in must first of all continue to do what it does very well. Second, it needs to focus on the big new challenges facing Europe and its citizens. Where appropriate, it should devolve some powers back to member states, municipalities and regions. And fourth, it must engage with citizens more and engage in much more direct democracy with citizens, sectoral groups and national parliaments. As you know, Ireland is a founder member of the Euro and a founder member of the single market. And we now, as a country, strongly support the completion of the single market and also the digital single market, which is the purpose of my recent visit to Tallinn. I want Irish people to be able to access cheaper mortgages from banks in other countries and insurance from lenders and insurers in other countries, and thereby bringing down the prices we pay and the rates we pay in this country. We also very much believe in free trade agreements, in completing monetary union. We believe in a banking union which will protect citizens' deposits on a pan-European basis and reduce exposure to taxpayers. And we also think that a capital markets union would provide the building blocks for an integrated capital market across Europe. We also need to continue to have a well-funded common agricultural policy and continue to fund those programmes and policies that already work in areas like research, innovation, Erasmus, Interreg, the European Investment Bank and others. And budgets for these should be protected. And if we develop new programmes, we should use new money to do so. I know at the moment there's a real interest in the idea of a defence union, a permanent structured cooperation framework, or PESCO. Ireland won't join a European army, nor will we be part of a single European defence budget. But we do want to be part of a common security and defence policy because we believe it's in our interest as a nation and also in the interests of the European Union. And the threats that we face are 21st century threats: cyber terrorism, cyber attacks, international terrorism, uncontrolled mass migration, natural disasters, trafficking of drugs and human beings. And we want to be involved in European actions against all of these. I also believe we can show much greater leadership on Africa, and I support the concept of an EU Marshall Plan for that continent. We should aim in the decades ahead to transform Africa in much the way that most of Asia has been transformed, from a place that we give aid to, a place from which migrants flee, to a region which is wealthy, democratic, better governed, a place that we want to trade with. In terms of improving democracy within the EU, we need to consider supporting a Europe-wide list for the European Parliament. Another reform might be to make permanent the Spitzenkandidat system for electing the President of the Commission, and also democratising the process for choosing candidates in other leading positions within the European Union, like, for example, the head of the Eurogroup. And through the EU, we could come together to establish a single pricing and reimbursement policy for medicines. We already have a single body, the EMA, which approves medicines, but we all pay different prices and have different reimbursement regimes. And that, I think, could save billions of euros for taxpayers and make medicines available to patients at the same time in every country, rather than the discrepancies that we have at the moment. And we can also establish a common asylum policy and system to replace the Dublin system, which isn't working, and I think we all appreciate that. And I think we can also put fire back in the engine of our social Europe by following through on the proclamation which we will issue in Gothenburg later this week on jobs, employment rights, pensions, and many other things. I also very much support the proposed subsidiarity and proportionality task force, which has been recently established. And it's always been interesting to me that many US states, many Canadian provinces, many counties even in the United States have greater autonomy and greater variation on some issues than we have among member states of the European Union. And I think we need to ask ourselves, do we have the balance right? Does everything have to be harmonised and standardised? And does everything that is currently harmonised and standardised have to stay that way? And I think these questions should also form part of our debate. To conclude, I think we can all agree that the EU has always offered the promise of a better future. But it is a future that will not be handed to us, and we must work to create it. By sharing our hopes, by seeking advice about our fears, and by searching for a better way of doing things, we can achieve a more perfect union, and we can create the European future that we want. And today's Citizens' Dialogue is the starting point for exactly that. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach, for that very wide-ranging, I think it's fair to say, and very comprehensive address. One thing, Taoiseach, if I may, and very conscious of your very busy schedule and our limited time, but if I may just pose a question to you, one thing that really came to mind, and interestingly, it's been coming up online as well, is this narrative that Ireland will need to deepen, we'll need to strengthen our established alliances in the EU. There is a concern, rightly or wrongly, that given what is scheduled to happen in 499 days' time from today, that Ireland might possibly have less friends at the EU table. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on this, in your experience in your meetings with your fellow EU leaders. Where are our areas, our shared areas of cooperation and mutual interests, which we can draw upon? And who will our allies be in an EU of 27?
Yeah, well, I think first of all it's important to say that we do have lots of friends in Europe, and we find that we have different alliances on different issues all the time. Very close to France on agricultural issues,
Sure.
for example. Very close to some of the Nordic countries, Benelux countries, on issues like tax. But a European Union without Britain is going to be a different place.
Sure.
It will reorientate the power balance, if you like, within Europe. and certainly will make the German-French axis when they come together much stronger than it would have been in the past. So I think it requires us to do two things. It requires us to increase our presence. We're doing that already. We're beefing up our team in Brussels. The Attorney General's staff has gone, I think, from 1 to 5 over Brussels, because we'll be the only common law country left in the EU after Britain leaves, and that has big consequences. I think Malta and Cyprus are sort of common law, but not in the way we are. And we will need to build new alliances, and some of that has started already. With the Baltic countries and the Nordic countries, and also some of the Benelux countries. I don't think we'll ever join a formal group in the way Visegrad exists, for example, but I do think we will need to build strategic alliances with like-minded countries, but not always the same countries. It'll often depend on the issues at hand. Okay,
so we're going to be very flexible and friendly with everybody, and we have friends at the table.
We'll be more strategic than that. But I wouldn't like anyone to think that Britain was our only friend, and Britain is now leaving. That wouldn't characterise the
facts.
But it is going to be a different Europe without Britain, and we need to prepare for that, and we already are.
That's great. That's excellent to hear. And Taoiseach, you referenced as well expanding Ireland's global footprint by 2025, and the need for us as a country to be proactive and indeed ambitious with our engagement with our fellow EU member states. How do you think, Taoiseach, we can go about making that engagement work for both Ireland and the EU, given that there's a rise in populism? We're living in very interesting times, I think it's fair to say.
Sorry, but didn't.
I suppose just how would you think that we go about combating the challenges of the rise of populism? How do we go about having a debate on facts, on trying to encourage people to robustly get involved with the discussion, but looking at the bigger picture as well?
Yeah, it can always be difficult to have a debate on facts, but I won't go there today. I think the best way that we can combat the rise of populism is through two things, really. Improving living standards for the start. I think there is a correlation between people voting for populists or voting for extreme parties and falls in living standards, or big gaps in living standards. And you see patterns in elections, in the Brexit referendum vote, in the elections in America, where communities and whole regions can feel left behind, and that makes them more susceptible to simplistic populist messages that are emotion driven rather than fact driven. And I think the other thing is through civic engagement and listening to people. People often feel that Europe is, it's a funny thing, it's a paradox. People, not all people, but a lot of people feel that Europe interferes too much in their day-to-day lives, but yet is very remote from them.
Yes,
and they don't often see the connection between how decisions are made and how they affect them in their business or in their daily lives. And actually Europe is very democratic. I know that, having been in politics and sitting around the European Council table, virtually nothing gets agreed without the support of the member state governments, all of which are elected, and the European Parliament, which is elected. But that perception isn't there. And I think listening to people more and being seen to do so is a big part of that.
Which is exactly, I think, why Taoiseach... Exactly. Which brings me very nicely on to the fact that I'm now going to invite Minister McEntee. I think is going to maybe just give a little bit of an outline of why we're here today, what the process is involved and about. But I'm also, Taoiseach, very conscious of your time.
Leaders' questions in an hour.
Yes, leaders' questions in an hour. So I will maybe ask you to exit to the stage right. And thank you very much, Taoiseach, for your participation and engagement. Thanks, Taoiseach. Thanks a million. See you again. Take care. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Taoiseach. And I think it's fair to say, Minister Coveney, Minister McEntee, that the Taoiseach actually touched upon a lot of the questions and the topics that we're here today to debate and to hear a little bit more about. So on that note, actually, Minister McEntee, I might turn to you. Hopefully, ladies and gentlemen, you should have seen the excellent video with Minister Coveney and yourself beforehand. You're in coordinating the government's engagement on the future of Europe. What is the idea behind these citizens' dialogues? Are there going to be future events? What's the process? What's the roadmap involved? And while you're talking about that, I'll strategically slip into the Taoiseach seat.
Well, firstly, I just want to thank everybody for being here this morning. I understand everybody has very busy schedules, but I hope that you are here because, like me, like Minister Coveney and the Taoiseach, you believe in Europe, you believe in what it represents, what it stands for, but you believe that the debate on the future of Europe is something that everybody needs to be involved in. So thank you for being here. Maybe just to outline a little bit as to why we're having this conversation, because I know we're going out live on Facebook. There are some people who are only really just joining the debate and are asking the question, what is this about? And as the Taoiseach rightly said, the debate on the future of Europe was always going to happen, and I suppose in a sense had already started. However, I think it's fair to say with the outcome of the referendum last year, with the decision of the British people to leave the European Union, this focus and renewed focus has been catapulted forward. And following that referendum, the remaining 27 member states met in Bratislava last year, and I suppose what could have been called crisis talks. They met to reflect on what had happened, but most importantly to try and identify how Europe could react and move forward. And I think most importantly what came out of that meeting was a European voice that was strong and that was united. There was a reaffirmation from all member states of their commitment to the European Union, to the European project, what it stands for, what it represents. There was a commitment to continue to work together, but most importantly to set out a future programme of development, working together on that. I think what was also important is that all member states acknowledge that the European Union is not perfect, and of course it's not, and as somebody said to me last week, it never will be. But I think with any organisation, even the most successful ones, there is always a need for reform, there is always a need for change, and the European Union is 60 years old. There's nothing wrong with that, but we need to make sure that we have a new vision that is attractive to all of our citizens. We have to remember here in Ireland, over 50% of people were not born when Ireland joined what was then the EEC, now the European Union. We need to make sure that we have a new vision that people can trust, that people want to support, but most importantly, that works for all of our citizens. And there have been a number of, I suppose, inspirations that we are basing this on and working on. Last year, the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, published a white paper on the future of Europe. It outlined a number of scenarios as to how we could move forward. Some of them focused on staying put, doing nothing different, moving as we are. Others focused on a two-tier speed change, focusing on certain areas. He also published a number of reflection papers focusing on areas like the social dimension, security and defence, our financial situations. What's important, though, about all of this is that none of these proposals or scenarios are exclusive. None of them are exhaustive. They are merely a basis for this discussion. That has been brought forward even more by the President of the Council, Donald Tusk, identifying the future of Europe as his leader's agenda or item over the next 2 years. But what all of this leads into, and I think what's been very clear, is that all of this debate has to come from the ground up. It has to come from what it is that our citizens want, what it is that our citizens need. And notwithstanding Brexit, and I think we have to acknowledge that absolutely there are significant challenges coming down the road because of Brexit, but as the Taoiseach has rightly pointed out, there are huge opportunities available to us also, and the debate on the future of Europe will continue with or without us. I don't know about you, but I certainly don't want to be left behind. Ireland has benefited hugely through its membership of the European Union over the last number of years, and we have a real opportunity not just to be part of this debate, but to actually be able to shape it and in certain areas lead it. And the Taoiseach has pointed and touched on some of the areas where we have benefited, and obviously we're in the Science Gallery here today. It's Science Week, and we know that millions of euro has been invested through the European Research Area, which was established through the European Union to help support, to help coordinate so much research that is going on in areas that are of significant importance to us, like climate change, like food security and energy security. So these are all issues and matters that are important to Irish people, so we want them to get involved in this. So how can they get involved? Why are we here? What is the whole process, I suppose, is the main question. What's important to say at the outset is that this is an organic process, that this will evolve as time goes on. But to start with, all of the people who are invited here today, you represent different countries, different political parties. You are here representing individuals' needs, industries as well. And what we would ask, following on from today, is that you would leave here and that you would start to engage with your own members, that you would start to ask them what kind of a future do they want to be part of, and how do they see Europe working for them. Of course, we hope to have a series of meetings, engagements, debates happening between now and the 9th of May, which is of course Europe Day. And this will be the opportunity for absolutely everybody to get involved. And the ways in which we're going to do that, firstly through our educational institutions, through our primary schools, and well, I know through the EMI. The Blue Star programme obviously is something that has developed and is hugely popular and allows us to engage with our young students. And we know that when you engage with primary school students, it inevitably filters down through the community, their parents and all of those who get involved, through our secondary schools and of course through our colleges and our universities. That debate has already started, and I've already begun engaging on, I suppose, the wider discussion as well as how Europe can benefit our students. We hope to engage through our various different institutions that I suppose are more predisposed to Europe, so the IIEA, again the EMI, the Commission, the Parliament, but we also want to bring it to other areas where people are not maybe engaged with Europe on a daily basis.
That's going to be important, I think, Minister.
I think this is the biggest challenge. People do not go about their daily lives thinking about Europe, maybe thinking about the future of Europe. So we need to go to where people are. We need to get involved and engaged in the various different industries, the organisations, the NGOs, and get people thinking in that way. Of course, we have an online element to it as well, and I hope we have the website there. This will be launched today, and you can see the various different tabs at the top where people can look at key documents, they can look at key speeches. There are a list of events that are already in the calendar that are taking place, but I think most importantly there is a tab there for people to get involved, and this is what we're asking people to get involved. They can click into it, put in their own email address, they'll get an email back, and they'll then be able to make a submission to focus on what it is that they want to focus on. Of course, then probably one of the biggest elements of this is our regional citizens dialogue. So a lot of the discussions and debates that are taking place will happen through the various different formats that I've mentioned. However, in the new year, we'll be hosting a series of regional citizens dialogues, and this will give absolutely everybody the opportunity to come forward and to discuss the issues that are important to them, that matter to them. Of course, we want there to be a social media element to it, so we want a healthy and open and honest debate. On Twitter, the hashtag is Future of Europe. We want that to keep moving, and I think what's important as well, and I'll finish up on this, is that there are no limits. So we don't want to tell people what they can or can't talk about. But for me, what's important is that we get down to what actually impacts on people's lives. As the Taoiseach said, sometimes there's a sense that Europe interferes, but they don't see how it actually benefits them. So we need to look at the economy, we need to look at jobs and growth, we need to look at how we can break down any barriers or difficulties to individuals or businesses expanding, creating jobs, developing. We need to look at how we can provide opportunities for all of our young people. We need to look at climate change, migration. All of these issues are extremely important, but it is a very much an open process. It is an organic process, and I would hope that as the citizens' regional meetings start next year, a lot of what's happening between now and then, the engagement with organisations, the meetings, will form and shape part of that debate as well.
Great. So I think, Minister, actually you've given a really comprehensive overview, I suppose, of how inclusive and non-prescriptive, if I can say that you want the process to be, that there is nothing is set in stone. We want to see what people's concerns are. We want to hear from the citizens, and your call to arms, I think resonated very strongly, encouraging people to get involved and have their say.
Yeah. And if they have differing views, this is not just for people who believe in Europe and what Europe stands for in the project. This is.
Well, it's important to be a kind of a constructive, critical friend, isn't it? That's great. Thank you, Minister McEntee. And I think, Minister Coveney, if I might bring you in here now. Certainly, Minister Coveney, it's important to remember, I think, when we're talking about the future of Europe, which we are this morning, we are not just and solely focusing on Ireland's place within the EU, nor are we overly debating the internal affairs of the European Union, if you like, but more crucially, and I think more critically and importantly, we're having a conversation on how we see the European Union's role in a global world how can it work with other countries? I think the Taoiseach touched upon this in his speech, and various other global partners outside of the EU to ensure political stability and economic prosperity. And I know that you've only recently returned yourself from a visit to the Horn of Africa. Mr. Coveney, what do you think should be the significance of the EU's global role in a very vastly changing 21st century? And how do you think, in your role as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, how can Ireland help to achieve this? Easy questions.
I'm not sure how long we have here, but first of all, welcome to everybody, to all the ambassadors that are here, all the people who are involved in public life, different organisations that you represent, all the academics that are here and students. I think the first 60 years of the European Union project has really been one of trying to improve the well-being of Europe. Sure. As the Taoiseach referred to, this is probably the greatest peace project in history. But it's moved on from that to become an economic project too. To become a functioning single market that is borderless from a trade point of view, one that has set up its own currency very successfully for the majority of members of the European Union, one that is now struggling to but determined to deal with the new security realities that we have to live with. But for me, the next 60 years of the European Union will be a continuation of focusing on well-being within the European Union and cohesion that can actually deliver that, but also the European Union's role globally and how that reflects the value system and the ambitions and aspirations of small countries like Ireland. I'm meeting the Latvian Foreign Minister later on today. He's coming to Dublin. So countries that have relatively small populations need to talk to each other, stick together, be part of a shared home that is the European Union, and in doing that, have a voice that they otherwise wouldn't have in all of the key areas. For me, one of the biggest ideas that we need to be discussing is how does the European Union become a global diplomatic superpower that can actually find ways of resolving conflict and tension and huge challenges in other parts of the world through partnership, through diplomacy, through economic development, where the European Union perhaps changes its approach from one of development aid and military peacekeeping to one of real economic development, technology transfer, investment, and actually complementing what we have and continue to need to do in the humanitarian space. So Africa is probably the best example of that. I mean, we have, Africa is our closest neighbor in terms of continents. We know that on the continent of Africa, with current trends, there'll be an extra billion people in the next 25 to 30 years. I've just come back from Ethiopia and Kenya. In Ethiopia alone, they have 2 million extra people coming of working age each year. So to simply stand still, their economy needs to find a way of creating 2 million jobs a year. That is the entire workforce of Ireland every year. Next door in Kenya, 1 million every year. Jobs have to be created. I mean, on the face of it, this is impossible. But the only way to address huge challenges like this, along with all of the other pressure points that are going to be part of that conversation, some of them that Helen has referred to, from climate change to food security, to water security, to regional conflict, to radicalization, to mass movement of people. At any given point in time, about 6 million children are on the move as migrants on the continent of Africa. So the idea that any continent, never mind any country, can solve its challenges and its problems on its own, in my view, is yesterday's thinking. And certainly the idea that any country serves their own interests by being more independent and less integrated with their neighbours, in my view, is certainly the thinking from a different century. And that is why Ireland continues to be so committed to the European Union. I think it's easier to see that when you're a small country. When you're a bigger country, it is sometimes more difficult to see that. But the truth is that in the next 30 to 40 years, no country in the European Union, no country in Europe, in fact, will represent more than 1% of the world's population. And we would probably have no cities in the top 30 in terms of population in the globe. So, you know, this is a changing world we're living in. It's rapidly changing and modernizing. We need to be in tune with that. That is why we are formalizing a structure for engagement and dialogue in terms of what is going to be the Irish fingerprint on that plan. Because we have something to say. In a strange way, we're the only country that will be saying it in English in the European Union in the context of this debate, which is a reminder, actually, of the diversity and the need for new alliances and friendships and partnerships for the future. But also it's a reminder of the need for close cooperation with Britain in the future too. Even though they won't be a member state, they will certainly be a friend and they will be integrated. Let's see in the next number of months to what extent and how that works. But certainly they need to be part of Europe's future, if not the future of the European Union. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the big ideas here does need to be around Africa. And it's no secret that I have very strong views on this, that the political structured engagement between the EU and the African Union, or Africa as a continent at the moment, is nowhere near what it needs to be. And I think that will be one of the issues under discussion at the EU-Africa Summit in a few weeks' time, which the Taoiseach will attend. So I think that's a real signal of how seriously Ireland is actually taking that issue as well.
Great, thank you very much, Minister Coveney. And I think just some of the figures and the statistics you referenced in your speech are incredible, and particularly one that stuck in my mind is that by 2060, no single EU member state will account for 1% of the global population, which goes to your point.
Yeah, and really what that means is that from a population point of view, we're all small member states. Yeah. That's not the case in terms of influence or economic turnover or certainly trade. European countries have a big influence on multinational forums like the UN, obviously, and there are many people here who have worked within the UN structures. I recognize a number of faces here. But the question is, how does the European Union, how do EU countries ensure that they have a voice that is listened to in the future? And in my view, the only way to successfully do that is to ensure that we stick together, that we debate robustly with each other what we want in terms of Europe's future, but also the impact that Europe has on other parts of the world, because that determines our future. I mean, if you think about Africa again, I mean, the idea that Europe at the moment is struggling to deal with migration of refugees across the Mediterranean and all of the human tragedy that comes from that, that we're unable to politically deal with that today, not to mind what we may have to deal with an extra billion people on that continent. I think that puts it into perspective, the actual extent of the challenge and the pace of change that we are going to have to deal with. And the only way we can do that is to stick together, not just as a European Union, but also to create new partnerships and alliances with others, with other like-minded countries, to make sure that our technology, our know-how, the mistakes that we've made and the learnings that we've got, that we have from that, can actually help others to make a transition for the good of their continents, but also to ensure that the relationship between other continents and the European Union is one that we can manage in the future. This idea of a fortress Europe, that somehow we can respond to migration and crises and radicalization and conflict on the edge of the European Union by building higher walls, is very, very naive thinking in the context of how the world operates now. So yeah, there are real consequences to this debate, and I hope that Irish people will be chatting about these things in pubs, on the streets, at home, over dinner, That's what we need to do as a government. We need to get that conversation into people's homes. Unfortunately, and I'm quite familiar with this as a former member of the European Parliament, we think that the European Union is quite a democratic structure, and actually technically it is. But the connection between what people are saying and thinking in their normal lives in Ireland is often very remote to the conversations that are happening in democratic institutions that Irish people elect people to be part of. And because of that, when big decisions are taken in the European Union, they often take people by surprise. And sometimes there's a resentment that comes with that. And so this does not need to be a conversation that is about institutional structures and how they interact with each other in the European Union. This needs to be a language of the streets in terms of what does this mean for me, in terms of what will Ireland look like as a multicultural, European, progressive, outward-looking country in the future. Where are my children going to find jobs? And how does being part of the European Union help them do that? Will they be safe? What will their homes look like in the future? And how do we integrate an undoubtedly more multicultural Ireland in the future in terms of the plans that we have? And the European Union has an extraordinary story to tell so far. And I think we need to be building on that. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Well, if I might go from the people of the streets to the people in the audience, I think that'll be my cue. What I'm hoping to do is take a number of questions. Given that we have an audience, I'm sure, following us, a global audience following us online, if people could state clearly we've two roving microphones, their name and their organisation, and to which minister they are posing the question, because basically it's Curmé Cúmse a lucht fécin atá deise guise agus ceistena ar chur na Harry agus díobh sibh sa bhaile ná déon darmas is féidir libh muid a tweetáil ag úsáid an Hasclub Future of Europe. So I'm going to take a couple of questions from members of the audience, and Alex and Kieran have our microphones. Don't be shy. Anyone has any questions? Sorry, the gentleman at the back there. Sorry, yeah, I'll try and take them in groups of three.
If I may ask both ministers on a question really about the structure of Europe, which Europe is trying very, very hard to identify with its citizens, to explain its policies. You talk about Europe being democratic, but not seen as democratic. Okay. Is there not one thing that is absent, and that is that the President of the European Commission is not elected by all of the people of Europe? Would that act itself, would that actually change itself, not establish effectively the reality in people's minds that it is a democratic institution and they have a direct link with it because they vote for its leader?
Okay, thank you very much. Good question. And I think... Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Stéphane Crouzat, French Ambassador. Congratulations on this launch. It's very exciting for us, in particular because President Macron was flagged the idea of launching what we call Convention démocratique, and what you're doing here is exactly in line with what we hope that other European countries will be doing. So we're very excited about this. Thank you very much. I have a little question about PESCO. You're one of the few countries that have not yet formally joined PESCO. Where do you see yourselves in the near future in that respect?
Great, thank you. And Ian, I think.
Thank you. Ian Talbot from Chambers Ireland. We did a straw poll, Minister McEntee, on our members on the options for Europe, and interestingly what came through as number one was carry on, and number two was do less more efficiently. And I think that might go back a little bit to the fear factor, fear of change. As we look to the future, and obviously, but I hate to mention the word, the post-Brexit future, which is obviously very important to us. How big a challenge, I guess it is for both ministers, how big a challenge is it to reposition Ireland so that European businesses know Ireland is there, and Irish businesses feel comfortable and they have the skills to diversify and expand into the European single market with greater capability and, as much as anything else, the confidence to move forward. I know you're doing a lot of work about, for example, expanding the embassies and embassy staff and so on. More to it than that. Would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. And Mr. McEntee, I might get you to, if you want to
Absolutely.
go first.
Well, I mean,
we'll divide it up between the two of you.
Yeah, I mean, the discussion around the institutions, and again, as Minister Coveney said, we don't want this to be maybe a debate about the European institutions, but this is something that is coming up time and time again. People feel as though those who are in some of the higher up positions have not been democratically elected. Obviously, we have our elected MEPs, of which do a fantastic job, I think, and unfortunately can't be with us today, but will be very much a part of the whole process. But I suppose this is a question that we will be asking people. This is a question that we don't want people to be afraid to come forward with. What kind of proposals or how would they see the institutions working moving forward without it being just a focus on the institutions? So, you know, again, this is going to form part of the discussion and part of the debate. I think when it comes to, and maybe I'll let the Minister touch on PESCO, because I know he's going to be attending a meeting in the coming few days, and obviously this will be decided at the European Council meeting in December. When it comes to our businesses and our industries, we can't discuss the future of Europe without Brexit, absolutely not. And I mean, we are and have already begun to support our own institutions supporting, so for example, Bord Bia, Enterprise Ireland, the IDA, to use the Taoiseach's term, beef up the teams that they have to be able to work and to engage. But actually, something else that I think that we really need to do, and this is probably coming through my engagement with the colleges and the universities, we need to get better at our languages. While absolutely we will be the only English-speaking country left, and while a lot of the work is done through English, I think to be able to engage with our counterparts within the European countries, to be able to create our own links, to be able to speak various different languages as well, I think will be Agus Gaeilge as well, I think will be extremely important moving forward. And perhaps in the same way that we have a significant focus on our sciences here in Ireland, that we need to have more of a focus in our languages. But again, it's about working with the various different industries. Minister Simon Coveney currently chairs a stakeholder forum which is engaging with the industries on Brexit, but we also have a Future of Europe element to that. So again, following on from today, I would ask all of you to engage with your members, to engage with those whom you represent, to identify what they feel the challenges will be moving forward, engaging with other European countries, and that it's a two-way flow of information. So we're not just telling you what we're doing or what we feel needs to happen, but that you're informing us in the debate. And that's why we're here again, that people can inform the debate. And when we, as a country, bring forward our own proposals on the future, that it will be informed by all of you.
So you want to be bombarded with information
and
requests and contacts?
Well, absolutely. This is why we're here. We want people to be involved, to get involved.
Fantastic. Mr. Coveney?
Yeah, just on some of those questions, maybe I'll start in reverse on the Chambers Ireland question. I mean, I can understand why people maybe want less Europe and more efficient European input. I know what they mean by Europe. I mean, we are Europe, but I know what they mean by that. I think, though, that if you look at the journey that the European Union project has been on, it's always been driven by big ideas. And I think that's what keeps it going, in terms of interest and excitement around change that is positive, that is new, that is powerful in the context of the member states being much stronger and better off together than being on their own. And I think there's a danger if it becomes a sort of a technical exercise around efficiency, that we maybe lose a bit of that togetherness. But I do take the point. The answer here isn't necessarily to get people more committed to the European Union concept. The answer isn't necessarily more Europe, more decisions being taken in Brussels, or more directly elected people, for example, making decisions for us, even outside of Ireland. I mean, I believe that most Irish people want a union of sovereign member states that work together in areas where they agree to pool sovereignty. I don't believe the majority of Irish people want the United States of Europe in a federalist structure where there's very strong central control. I think that is, and while I'm deeply committed to the project and where it's going, I think it is important to understand the fears and concerns that some may have of balancing what it means to be Irish and the uniqueness of that identity with also what it means to share a future with others in the same union. And that's a very interesting balance that I think we need to hear from people on in the context of this debate. We should never take for granted their views on those issues. But we need a practical response too. In the context of Brexit, we are significantly beefing up our teams and embassies in big European capitals, in particular in Berlin and Paris. We will need to lobby a lot more, and we will need to be more proactive politically on policy and issues in the European Union in the future. The truth is that on some things, we came in behind Britain and benefited from their diplomatic muscle in areas like taxation, their approach towards globalization, their approach in terms of counteracting protectionism, if and when it emerges in debates. And of course, the big irony for Britain is that, in many ways, they were the chief architect of the common market and how it functions. And are now the ones choosing to leave it, which is, an irony that hasn't been lost on a lot of people. So we will, and as the Taoiseach said, there are obvious partners for us in some of these areas. Nordic countries, Benelux countries, Baltic countries, and indeed some of the countries on the eastern borders of the European Union, like the Czech Republic, for example, who would have a very similar outlook to Britain and Ireland on globalization and trade and competitive business environments and so on. In terms of PESCO, we actually had a long debate on PESCO this week at the Council of Ministers meeting, at the FAC meeting. 23 European countries have already signed up, including a number of neutral states, or militarily non-aligned states. So Ireland has signalled that we think PESCO is a good thing. We would like to be part of it. But we need to make a government decision on that, and we'll be doing that in the next 2 weeks, probably next week actually, in Cabinet. But I don't want to take the government decision for granted. There's a conversation to be had. But just to reassure people, partnership and security cooperation is something that countries contribute to on a voluntary basis. It allows countries to work together in a structured way on security issues. And I think it will be a very positive thing for Ireland, as indeed it will be for many other countries, which is why the vast majority of countries will join this structure. We'll be able to do things together like improve marine surveillance, a much improved structured response to cybersecurity, and obviously a tighter cooperation on issues like radicalization and terrorism across the European Union. These are all necessary things to protect Irish people's interests, as well as making the European Union as a whole a safer place. So I believe that PESCO doesn't compromise Ireland's traditional neutrality stance. It doesn't undermine the triple lock system. And as I said, this is something that we opt in or out of, depending on the project and what we're comfortable with. Finally, just on the structure of Europe, do I think it's a good idea potentially to have a directly elected President of the European Commission? I'm not sure about that, actually. I think on the face of it, it sounds like a good idea, but I think most Irish people see the European Commission as a sort of European civil service, as opposed to a European government. I still think people are more comfortable with the big decisions in terms of leadership in the European Union being made by heads of state together, as opposed to a European Commission who are really there to develop policy, to implement policy, to enforce the rules, to ensure we have a level playing field, and yes, also to facilitate new ideas. But I think the role of the European Commission needs to be understood. I don't believe in giving the European Commission more and more and more power and solving the democratic deficit issue by simply directly electing them. I'm not sure that's the answer. Having said that, I would be open to persuasion on that. I do think actually potentially directly electing a head of the European Commission would certainly give people more ownership. It's a little bit like a directly elected mayor, I suppose, of a city, which I'm a big supporter of. So I'd be open to that, but I wouldn't like to, and I think there are positives that would come from that, but I'm not sure that in itself will deal with the connection issue between the European Commission and people across the European Union. I still think they look to their own governments primarily for leadership and decision making at a European level more than they do to the Commission.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, for that. And I'm delighted to say my bribe or my threat worked, ladies and gentlemen, because we are trending on Twitter. So bravo. So before you arrived, Minister Coveney, Mr. McEntee, I said we'd wrap up on time if we got trending on Twitter. So we're on track, ladies and gentlemen, which is great. Some of the questions that have been coming in on Twitter and online, Minister McEntee, very interesting. Great engagement from the USI, from the European Youth Parliament, from our young people. And I know, Minister, that you are, I think, due to travel on Friday to Gothenburg with the Taoiseach for the Social Summit for Fair Jobs and Growth. And I'm sure that the topic there will be on how do we promote jobs and fair growth in the EU, and I suppose the European Pillar of Social Rights. That is set to be signed, and as it does, setting out 20 principles working towards social progress in the EU to encourage a more efficient labour market and implement welfare system reform. How important do you think it is that the EU retains its progress and its momentum and its focus on improving the social agenda, whilst also trying to drive and grow the economies of the different member states?
I think it's extremely important, and as the Taoiseach alluded to, he will be signing the declaration at the Social Summit, which I'll be attending, and also our Minister for Social Protection will also be attending. I think sometimes governments, and not just our own, but throughout Europe, are often accused when we talk about I suppose what is on the agenda and what we are discussing, of not focusing on the social issues, of focusing on the institutions, of financial matters and other areas, which are of course extremely important. However, I think we have an opportunity here, as I said earlier, not just to be part of this debate, but to actually drive this debate in that area. I mean, if we look at the facts and the figures throughout Europe, we have, I think it's 11 million people, or 11 million jobs have been created since the crash through the European Union. But what kind of jobs, what kind of environments are people working in? Where are these jobs going? We focus on our young people, and I talked earlier about opportunities for our young people. Youth unemployment is still far too high, while it's somewhat lower here in Ireland. It is still too high across the European Union. How can we work and make the environment better for our young people to be able to live, to work, to travel, to prosper freely throughout the European Union? We also have to look at certain issues, and in my previous role as Minister for Older People, I was all too well aware of the fact that we are a changing demographic. We are an ageing population, while Ireland is the second youngest population in Europe. We are also an ageing population, and at the moment, for every one person who is retired within Europe, there are 4 people working, 4 people supporting them. However, in the decades to come, that number will change from 2 to 1, or from 1 to 4 to 1 to 2. So there is, and there needs to be a massive focus on how our communities work, how we support each other, and how we ensure moving forward, given all of the figures that Minister Coveney and the Taoiseach have identified here, and the fact that we won't be the major players on a world stage. How can we still have that influence? How can we make sure that people can go about their daily lives, and that they have the opportunities that they currently have now, and that they have further opportunities now? So, you know, a lot of the discussion on Thursday and Friday will be around employment rights, but I know there'll be an indirect discussion, shall we say, over lunch about education. Again, somewhere where Ireland has benefited hugely. We only have to look at the fact that we have hundreds of millions of euros being invested in our own programmes through the European Social Fund on employability, on training, on learning. We have funding being put into our Youth Guarantee Scheme. I was at here in Trinity only a few nights ago, the 30th anniversary of the Erasmus programme, which again has provided huge opportunities for young people throughout Europe. So it's how do we build on all of those issues? How do we improve them? How do we make them work better for people? And where are the gaps? Where can we, I suppose, identify those gaps? So again, it goes back to our engagement within the universities, the schools, the colleges, but also for those who aren't in education, for those who aren't maybe in the formal settings, we need to make sure that we reach them. We need to make sure that people's standard of living remains at a level that it, I suppose, remains at the level that it is now, but that it is also improved.
And just in terms of engaging, I suppose it's also important, the Oireachtas and the Joint Committee on EU Affairs is also asking people to get involved and has a consultation process on the future of Europe, and I know that's something that...
Absolutely, and just to congratulate the committee for the work that they've done so far as well. You know, we're not the only ones working on this, but it is all feeding in. We are all working together, so I would encourage people to get engaged in that process. They have already had a number of submissions and representations before the committee as well. Particularly focusing on our young people as well. So I would encourage people to get involved. So this is all about people being involved, identifying the key issues that matter to them. But I really think, because we're not going to lead in the area of migration, it is obviously something that we are very supportive of and are playing our part. However, it doesn't impact us in the same way as it does some of our more eastern countries. We are not going to lead in some other fields. However, in the social context, I do believe this is an area that we can lead on.
Great. Thank you very much, Minister McEntee. And I think that brings us nicely on to Minister Coveney, who's going to conclude proceedings with some closing final remarks. I normally try not to pick out an individual tweet, but I think this one is too good to too good to ignore. When we spoke about do we have any friends left in Europe, somebody very cleverly has said, well, Denmark is off the table after last night. But I'm sure that's only a temporary blip. So what I propose to do is Minister Coveney will conclude proceedings. Over to yourself to say some final remarks, I suppose, as how we look to addressing the challenges of Ireland's continuing membership of the EU. As we see as a country, Minister Coveney, as you've already said, our role is in that European Union. How do we make sure that we are having our voice heard, that we continue to influence, shape and reform it? So over to you, Minister Coveney.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Maybe
yes, of course. Yeah.
Stand up to make sure everybody is still focused. No, first of all, look, this is the start of a really important dialogue, and we want everybody in this room, but also thousands and thousands of other people to get involved as well. So Minister McEntee is going to be leading this project, and it's going to be in various different parts of the country, and it's really going to try to reach out to get hopefully a robust and controversial and passionate conversation going about what we want our country to look like in the future. And for any parents here, I think if you look at your children and you start asking yourselves the question, what kind of country do you want them to live in the future? Then that is actually what the Future of Europe debate should be about for you, in terms of the kind of opportunities that they will have, the kind of say that Ireland will have in the future about its own well-being, and all of the multiplicity of factors that influence our own well-being, that we can maximise our influence over and contribution to through our membership of the European Union. While it is a reality that Brexit is going to, in some ways, dominate the debate on the European Union and Ireland's relationship with it in the coming months, that does not mean that we can't have this broader debate in parallel at the same time, and we need to have it. For the next 12 months or so, there is going to be a structured debate across most countries in the European Union. And in fact, the truth is, even though it seems to be news to some, that in most countries in the European Union, this debate is actually a much bigger political deal than Brexit is right now. Because for many people, they see Brexit as a decision that's been made that actually now simply needs to be managed in terms of the rollout of that. To try to put as sensible and as good a deal together in the context of an agreement with the United Kingdom as they leave the European Union. For Ireland, of course, it's very different because it matters so much. But the big issues for the European Union, depending on where you live in the European Union, may be the relationship with Russia, it may be migration, it may be security and terrorism, it may be future cohesion, it may be youth unemployment, it may be practical things that allow commerce and trade and economics to function in a fairer and more efficient way. Or it may be the need to develop new partnerships and new relationships, as undoubtedly we need to do. For some, it will be about enlargement in the future. There are 5 or 6 countries that are in a process to join the European Union. And they also have demands and aspirations and reasons to be part of this project, which evolves all the time. So the idea that we would let others decide the future shape and the future priority list for the European Union in terms of how we spend our resources and the political priorities that are set, in my view, would be a huge missed opportunity, but much more than that. Because when those decisions actually become reality in the future, we do not want Irish people saying, well, sorry, we didn't sign up to that. This isn't the kind of Europe that we want. And so now is the time to actually ask people, what do you want from Irish membership of this union? How does it strengthen the aspirations that we have as a country in the future? And this is a golden opportunity. And there hasn't really been a process like this before that I'm aware of anyway in the European Union, which is a real attempt to try to have a democratic discussion and debate that can then influence the decision-making process as it goes forward. And the European Commission and in many ways the European Council, they, I think, want to and are willing to listen to the outcomes of debates in different countries in an effort to try to make sure that the institutions move closer to the electorate and to communities in the European Union rather than the other way around. And I think this did come from a real concern after the Brexit debate, after a number of very high-profile elections in different European countries, where there was a sense that populism and a new form of nationalism was starting to challenge the concepts that actually have held the European Union together as a project for the last 60 years. And there's been a real response to that, which in my view is a positive one, around the need to listen to people, to make sure that small countries as well as big countries are heard. And while some may say that the dynamic between France and Germany now may be the real driver in terms of future EU development, I think that politicians in France and Germany are more than aware of the need to also ensure that the very essence of the European Union, which is that small countries matter, and that small countries see the European Union as a way of ensuring that their voice is heard, is not undermined by any future thinking or future planning in the European Union in terms of how we make decisions in the future. So please engage with this process. It is going to make a difference, and it allows the government, through the relevant EU institutions, and indeed opposition parties, through the European Parliament and through the other structures that are there, to ensure and to have the backing of a process like this to make sure that the positions that we take are really grounded in the credibility of that debate and that discussion that takes place between now and the 9th of May next year. And the danger, of course, is, and this is always a danger with a discussion on the EU, is that this becomes a discussion of sort of Europhiles, and I count myself as one of them, that we talk to each other in an in-depth way and an informed way about the future of Europe, but that it doesn't actually break out of that bubble at all. And I think that would be a real failing if this process allows that to happen. Instead, as I say, this needs to be about getting a conversation going in people's homes and in pubs about what membership of the European Union actually really means. We're starting from a good place. You know, all of the recent surveys suggest that actually a higher percentage of Irish people are committed to the European Union than any other country in the European Union, which is actually, a hugely positive place to start here. I think the latest figure was 88% of people in Ireland want to remain part of the European Union and are deeply committed to it, and don't want Ireland to move in the direction that our closest neighbour, unfortunately, has decided to move in. So this is a serious process. We're going to put the necessary resources into it, and I want to thank the partners that are working with us to make sure that it's a success. And hopefully the outcomes will excite people about what we can do together with other European countries to make sure that Ireland's interests are represented, to make sure we can look forward to a safe and secure country that is about opportunity and protection and quality of life issues, the kind of things that the Taoiseach talked about earlier. But also, I think, for those of us who go beyond that ambition of simply the well-being of our own country and want Ireland to have an impact internationally on other crises in different parts of the world and in terms of how they develop and roll out in the future, it will give us an opportunity to discuss those kind of ambitions too. Because let's not forget the Irish mindset. It is very much a global one, actually. There are very few families, I suspect, represented in this country that don't have family members that have either travelled or are in some other parts of the world working as we speak. So thanks for taking the time to be here, and please be part of this process. Be blunt, be direct, be challenging, be critical, but also try and be positive. And the outcomes, I think can be exciting and hugely valuable in the context of the work that the government needs to do to make sure that Irish interests are protected and that Irish concerns and ambitions are heard in the context of the decisions that are taken for the future. So whether you're a farmer, great to see John Bryan here, whether you're a fisherman, whether you're a business person, whether you're an unemployed person, whether you're whatever age you are. I'm not allowed to say young and old anymore, apparently. This matters for everybody. And so let's make this process work together. It's important. Thanks very much for taking the time to be here.
That was great. Thank you. Míle buíocha Shari Coveney agus Macantí agus a Taoiseach bhórgain bhór cuid rátas níos luath inniuh. Sin deir leis an lá cóide ach bí cinse fannacht de deagháling agus gur raibh míle maithe go léir as a bheith inniu agus as a bheith mar cuid den idir phléis seo. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your very active engagement, your participation today. We were trending on social media, and I think we have a huge range of questions, debate and dialogue that have been coming in across the different platforms and here this morning, which I think, Minister Coveney, certainly bring your call to action and call to arms, bring it into force. And as Minister McEntee said, this is part of a process of a dialogue. We're going to be going around the country. We want you to have your say, reach out to your networks, to your friends, to your families, and make sure that all of us are working together to make and ensure that the Irish voice is heard and continues to shape and influence what type of European Union we want to live in. If I could thank the Taoiseach, Minister Coveney and Minister McEntee for their excellent contributions today. I think we can safely say that Ireland's Future of Europe Citizens Dialogue process and the journey has been well and truly launched here in the Science Gallery this morning as part of Science Week. As Minister McEntee advised and launched on the website, a reminder to you all, please keep an eye on dfa.ie/EU. So that Department of Foreign Affairs website page will be updated with Future of Europe debates, dialogue, questions and all the information and upcoming events. Stay involved, spread the word, have your say, and we look forward to seeing you again over the next number of months. Thank you very much.